WiSP Sports Radio, the voice of women in sport.
Hello, and thank you for downloading the WiSP Sports Desk, our weekly news magazine show with me, Chris Stafford, alongside my co-host Nancy Gillen from Inside the Games. This is Season 2, Episode 19. So before we get started and bring in our guest this week, a word from our sponsors. Dive into summer and enjoy it to the fullest. Cheer on your family Olympians and keep the members of your team diving, swimming, and just having summer fun with Highlands Earache Drops. Highlands wants to make sure your summer fun isn't ruined by ear pain. Highlands Earache Drops provide natural relief from pain, fever, irritability, and occasional sleeplessness associated with earaches. Highlands has been trusted by generations to provide safe homeopathic medicines for everyone in your family. After you've been diagnosed by a physician, try Highlands homeopathic earache drops or tablets. Earache drops are available at CVS stores. To learn more, go to highlands.com/ear. That's HYLANDS, highlands.com/ear. Claims are based on traditional homeopathic medicine, not accepted medical evidence, not FDA evaluated. Always read and follow label directions. Well, Nancy Gillen, we're back in business this week. Another episode, another week of sport, trying to get it back on track. How's it going, internationally? Are you seeing a bit of a shift?
I think, yeah, in some countries we're having sport get back to normal. So I know in South Korea there's been some baseball and football being played again. In Germany, the Football League started last week, which is quite exciting. So sport definitely is starting again, but there's definitely a long way to go before we're fully back to normal.
Yeah, sport is making its comeback. Well, joining us this week to talk about the bigger picture and some of the issues that Nancy Hogshead-Makar, who is a champion for women's sport, representing them as an advocate, as a civil rights lawyer. Most people know her in the US as being a fighter for women, for sure. And we're going to focus on just one aspect, Nancy, of what you're focusing on right now because of the international picture here, where national federations as well. So sexism and the abuse of athletes in sport. But anyway, welcome back, Nancy. You've been a regular visitor to WiSP Sports, haven't you, over the last few years?
Yeah, thanks for having me on, Chris. I appreciate it. This is such a great outlet for women in sports to be able to get the news out.
That's right. And get the news out. And also the topics. We obviously, as you know, cover what's happening on the field of play, but also what's off the field of play. And that's where you keep yourself very busy. I mentioned national federations, international federations. The fight is still on, isn't it, to protect women from abuse and particularly sexism in sport from your perspective. Tell us where you are now, what you're working on.
Sure. I've been involved in the issue of protecting athletes in the Olympic movement, particularly from sexual abuse. Throughout the world, there are different layers of protection. Criminal law plays their part. Family law plays their part. Usually have children family services that plays a part. Civil law plays a part, right? But really what you need is for international federations to deal with this as to create a separate entity to take reports, well, first of all, to do education on abuse, but also to take reports and to sanction, to get people out of the Olympic movement, kind of the way that an HR department at a business would get somebody out of the business. Or at a school, you'd have a title, in America, you'd have a Title IX office, right? But the school would say that, somebody's a drug dealer or, but if somebody abuses athletes, then they're kicked out of the school. So we need this separate entity to be able to address sexual abuse. We as a human species love our fellow mankind. We're very loyal as a species, and normally that has kept us alive for 1 billion years, but that is a function that a pedophile or a abuser will latch onto, so that people want to rally around the abuser. And consequently, in my experience, I'm an expert witness in the Larry Nassar case. It happens over and over and over and over again before we can get this person out of sport. It's hard enough in the United States with somebody with getting them out of sport, but for most of the world, there is no remedy. There's no way to get that abuser out of sport. So international federations, the International Olympic Committee needs to create a system, kind of the way that they've done with doping, with the World Anti-Doping Association, or with in the United States, we've got USADA here. There's just no way that Lance Armstrong would be out of sport, but for WADA and USADA. So same thing here. We've got to figure out a way to get those who are abusing athletes out of sport.
So what does this require then? Setting up the equivalent to a WADA in terms of, it has to be global, it has to be an international organization,
right?
That would police this in a meaningful way, and that would cross all jurisdictions.
Yeah, correct. So we need to, right now we have CAS for sports disputes that, but
the Council for Arbitration of Sport, which is playing an important role.
Yes. So CAS in the past has done a good job when it doesn't act like a police type, like what we're envisioning here. Instead, CAS operates when you have a very motivated party who wants to get a coach out of sport. Typically, a bunch of athletes will band together and say, this coach has, molested all of us. And so, that's happened a number of times. But what you need instead is to have an entity that will go out and do the investigation and bring the hearing, to get the coach out.
So what representation is being made here in this country then, Nancy, to bring this change about with national federations and international federations?
Well, this is what Champion Women's doing. So I wrote back in 2013, I wrote the draft of what the United States Center for Safe Sport should look like, and everything from like what standard should be used and what kind of evidence should be used and what's the statute of limitations, and we are adapting that now for an international audience, and so figuring out the best places for it to get published, and both you, Chris, and Nancy can help a lot with how do we get it after we write it. How do you get it distributed, and how do you get it taken up? But it's going to take a lot of advocacy for people to, it's going to cost money. The U.S. Center for Safe Sport right now is taking in 220 complaints of just sexual abuse a month. 220 complaints a month.
Yeah.
That's just one country.
Yeah.
So when, we've got this painful reckoning of we've allowed sport to be this cauldron of abusing athletes, and some of the tactics where people think, oh, that's what it takes to make a great athlete is really abuse. And when somebody's emotionally and physically abused, it sets them up to be sexually abused. So we're right in the middle of having this reckoning of no more Marta Carolis, no more Bella Carolis. The damage that they inflict is way too much. It's too much. Winning is there are. It's sort of a false conflict to think like you can either have really good coaching and excel at the highest levels, or you can not be abusive. That's a false choice between those two.
So you're writing a white paper, are you, then, for this, Nancy? Is that my understanding?
Yes, exactly. Yes. So we are about, I would say, 9/10 of the way there. And, our next steps are getting it published and getting it adopted. What FIFA has done is to add a human rights uh, uh, um, a part of their governing documents. And there's a human rights part of all of the bid documents to be able to get a sport, to be able to get a big international competition. And right, so then they've done it that way. So remember, we saw the women who were in Afghanistan who were being abused, who were on the national team. They had to get out of the country. Human Rights Watch was instrumental in being able to get them out. But it is that human rights embedding it into the International Federation that allowed them to be able to do it. That's like the most egregious case. We need to make sure that, a coach who just abuses one athlete, that there is a remedy. There's a way to get the coach away from athletics, to not let them be part of the Olympic movement.
What do you see as a stumbling block then, or a hurdle in your pursuit of getting this international adoption to, a common message here and a system? Nancy, do you see this being a challenge with different cultures to get it adopted internationally, or is this got to come again from the IOC down?
I see that it's not a new problem. My coach is on the banned list because he was molesting my teammate at the time. She's been very public, so it's fine if I say Mitch Ivey was abusing Suzette Moran, and it was certainly not the first. So this is not a new problem. The issue is that sport governing bodies in the past have said, not my problem. I'm going to let the police handle this. I'm going to let, it's somebody else's problem. So yes, I may know about it, but I'm going to turn a blind eye. And we talked about how that people tend to want to support their buddies, and that's natural, which is exactly why we have to have this, an independent entity to do these investigations and whatnot. But I see the biggest stumbling block is, number one, not my problem. Let somebody else take care of it. Isn't that awful if that happened?
Awful, absolutely.
Yeah, but I'm saying it almost like facetiously when you say, yes, we all agree that it's awful, but who's going to pay for that? Who's going to, right? You got to hire a full team of investigators and people who know how to do and be able to bring the AAA arbitrations to be able to have sanctions and effectively get somebody out of sport. That all, the IOC and the international federations, they don't want in general to have conflict, right? They want to be able to make money, and they want to sell sponsorships, and they don't want this to be the cover story, right? They want good, positive things coming. And listen, nobody is more supportive of the Olympic movement than I am. I think that that the Olympics at its best brings together the world and celebrates the highest ideals of people who have their 10,000 hours in the sport. But so to get them like, okay, you're not just about money and medals, you're also here, and you've got to make sure that the athletes are safe. And up until now, you've done a pretty good job of making it pretty easy for coaches to abuse athletes.
Yeah. Nancy Gillen, your perspective from an international standpoint.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, it's. I think it's something that it does affect such a range of countries, like you were saying with the Afghanistan case. It's not almost more expected there, but I think kind of that it's less likely that checks are going to be in place in kind of certain cultures. But I think that is why the US Gymnastics case really kind of shocked people, because it shows that no matter what, that it's just, yeah, like you said, kind of about being in a position of power, and that abuse is systematic throughout all of sport across the world. So it sounds really, important. I think, like you said, having the independent body that can check kind of all countries and make sure that it doesn't happen again. Do you think, kind of in terms of financially, because obviously the pandemic is going to have a quite big impact on a lot of federations financially, do you expect to kind of have any issues in almost trying to put across the importance of spending money on kind of ensuring that sexual abuse is out of sport?
I think that we've gotten into a bad situation right now, and there's going to be a lot of upfront money, say for, particularly the first 5 or 10 years, because we have allowed the system to get really bad. So with the virus, I'm just not very sympathetic in saying like, well, we don't have as much money because of the virus. You have money. I mean, particularly sports like FIFA, the IOC, there absolutely is money there. What we're having the problem in the United States is that who has the power are the coaches. And they don't want the U.S. Center for Safe Sport. They're not used to having somebody with oversight over them. None of the coaches are. We've allowed this whole system to develop with no oversight over over how a coach treats athletes. And so as a result, you have very high rates of abuse. You have not had you'll notice that as the stigma lessens, as people can say, I was raped, that I was sexually assaulted, that I was abused as a child, that the more that you hear that, the easier it is for the next person, the next person, the next person. When those gymnasts came forward, the number of reports that came to the U.S. Center for Safe Sport from all across sports, from all ages and timelines, skyrocketed. And they stay up. So in the United States, every time that there is the Bill Cosby case, the Kavanaugh case, every time another case comes, they'll get another spike in reports. So I would expect that as the world starts losing the sexism and the rape culture that does a really good job of silencing victims, that as victims feel more free about coming forward, that you're going to see more and more demand on sports governing bodies to do something about it, to do their part.
Well, this I want to dig a little bit deeper another time, Nancy, if you would come back, because the whole issue of the U.S. Centers for Safe Sport, the methodology there, the way of doing business has been criticized, and without the focus being on the victims, and I think there's a lot of different perspectives here, but whether their method is right or wrong, or how, I think a lot of people say it's flawed, and what can be done to bring about some changes there. So maybe you could come back and talk about that another time, Nancy.
Chris, I'll always come and talk to you.
I appreciate
it.
I
love I love seeing what you're doing, and I'm a big fan of Inside the Games, and certainly read all the time. But anytime that you would like me to come on, I'm really happy to.
Well, fantastic. Anyway, just the tip of the iceberg here, but when we have more time, we'll dig a little bit deeper. I really appreciate you taking the time to come on the show, Nancy. Thank you so much. Stay safe out there and stay in touch.
You too, Chris. Okay, take care, Nancy. Bye, guys.
Thank you.
Take care.
As sport comes back from the pandemic, I think people are realizing that we can kind of almost rebuild the sporting world as it was. So obviously before the pandemic happened, women's sport was quite underfunded. It was underrepresented. It wasn't, kind of on the same level as men's sports whatsoever. And I think there's been some really, really good work done, and it's been, built up to a stage where even in like 5 years ago, I wouldn't have thought, the amount of women's football games on TV or women's rugby or, a lot of female sports stars have really high profile now that I wouldn't even have thought that could have been possible 5 years ago. So they've really kind of built it up to a stage where it can kick on. And then obviously the pandemic happened. And I think there are concerns that when sport comes back, if there isn't real investment in the women's game, then it's possible that women's sport may actually go backwards. And I think that the article about the women's football and comparing it to men's football, I think, talks about that, giving football as the example. Because, well, in England anyway, they're hoping to get the Premier League, the men's football tournament, back next month. But the women's tournament, over the past few days, it's become quite clear that it's been cancelled. I don't think that's necessarily a bad move, because it is just kind of the finances involved. I think the Premier League is able to get back up and running, and it won't lose too much money in terms of not having revenue, not having fans coming in, while the Women's League wouldn't be able to do that. But I think it's more the concern that priority might be given to men's teams to make sure they're financially sound, and the same won't happen for women's teams. And we've already seen a few women's teams go bust because of it and disband. And I mean, it could quite easily happen to a couple of the other teams as well. So yeah, I think there are just concerns that the pandemic may, cause quite a big step back for women's sport.
Yeah, and I've noticed it was a male sports writer in the Telegraph, the British Telegraph, that said the rise of women's football must not be stunted by absurd economics of the men's game. Sounds like he's really hit the nail on the head there.
Yeah, definitely. And I think here anyway, there's just it's basically two extremes. Like the men's game, you're talking hundreds of millions of pounds in terms of how much players are worth, how much they get paid each week or each month, the amount you have to pay for tickets, even kits, how much you have to pay for kits. Like everything involved in men's football is just just an absurd amount of money involved in it. And then at the other end, you've got the women's league and the women's game, where not that many teams are even professional. You've still got players that have part-time jobs. It only costs something like £5-10 to go to a game, and then players are still, their wages there are only a few women footballers here who are on high wages. So I think, and especially there has been criticism in general about the men's game coming back next month, and I think it is because people are thinking they're putting money ahead of health. But that is kind of, they're again putting money ahead of the women's game here, because they're focusing too much on getting football back on the pitch, to not lose money from the men's game, and instead of thinking, what can we do to make sure that both the men and the women's games survive and are sustainable for the future?
Yeah, absolutely. We'll have a link, of course, to these stories, as always, as well as the other stories we cover here on the WiSP Sports Desk, in the show notes accompanying this episode at wisports.com. That includes Samantha Lewis's article in The Guardian, Women's Role in Sport Must Be Addressed in Post-Coronavirus Recovery. And she goes on to say representation matters, with an entire generation of new fans and players at risk of being lost. It's a good story, worth reading. Links in the show notes. And we're moving on to another football story too now, aren't we?
Yeah, so this is about the FIFA Women's World Cup in 2023, which is the next edition of the tournament. And it was set to be decided in June. That was expected. But then the FIFA Congress, where the decision was meant to be made, was then postponed until September or November. They're not too sure when, because obviously the pandemic is making things very uncertain at the moment. But they have confirmed that they're still going to name the winner of the Women's World Cup bid in June. So I imagine the FIFA Council are just going to meet virtually and decide, and then they're going to announce that. So I think that is a good move, because it just gives whichever country wins, it gives them more time to prepare, and shows that they're still quite committed to making sure that the bidding process goes smoothly. So just as a reminder, there's 4 bids for that tournament, a joint bid between Australia and New Zealand, one from Brazil, one from Colombia, and one from Japan. So it's quite a good range of countries. Having looked at the bids, I think Australia and New Zealand is the strongest bid, but you never know with FIFA. There's always quite a rogue choice popping up sometimes. So maybe it will go to one of the others.
Okay, and you've got a swimming story from an Australian swimmer. What's that about?
Yeah, so this is Shayna Jack, who is she was a Commonwealth Games gold medalist at the Commonwealth Games in 2018 in Australia, and she tested positive for anabolic agent. It's a non-steroid, in June, just after the Swimming World Championships. And this was quite a big story because she was quite young. She's only 21, and she was kind of seen as a rising star. And then there was also at that competition a lot of controversy because there was a Chinese swimmer called Sun Yang who he has now been found guilty of doping charges, but he had had prior suspicion. And an Australian swimmer, he won gold at the World Championships, and an Australian swimmer on the podium refused to be on the podium with Sun Yang because he was protesting against the fact that he thought Sun Yang should have been given a suspension. And then days later, it came out that Shayna Jack had tested positive for a prohibited substance. So it was at the time, I think, quite embarrassing for the Australian team. And she has appealed it at CAS, who we were talking about earlier, and she's protested her innocence, and she's kind of just written quite a long social media post where she says that the system is seriously flawed, and also that people, as soon as you get accused of anything, you're immediately kind of found guilty, and everyone thinks you're guilty, and it's more just that you have to prove that you're innocent. And she's just kind of criticizing that. But it's quite an interesting case, and it's something that I've always found quite interesting about the whole doping system and athletes, is that normally, because there are such a high number of kind of Russian athletes doping, if there is a Russian athlete that's found guilty of a doping offence, people automatically think, oh, they're definitely guilty. But it's interesting when athletes from other countries have tested positive. I think there's a lot more sympathy, which I don't know if is necessarily right or wrong. So it'd be interesting to see how her case goes, and whether she is innocent or whether they find her guilty.
A very good point. Now, as Nancy was talking about USA Gymnastics, you do have a story about an athlete, a US athlete, criticizing USA Gymnastics. Tell us about that.
Yeah, so this does link in quite well to what we were talking about before. And this is Laurie Hernandez, who won gold at an Olympic. So she is an Olympic gold medalist from Rio. And she made claims against her coach, Maggie Haney, back in 2016. And it was that she'd been emotionally and verbally abused. So Haney was accused of screaming, threatening, bullying, and harassing the gymnasts and forcing them to compete even if they were injured. And Hernandez has said that she made these claims in 2016, but it was only until last year that a case was opened against Haney. So I think we were talking about just then, there is such inaction over abuse claims, and that it's always quite slow. And she was found guilty, Haney, and she has been banned for 8 years by USA Gymnastics. But it suggests that the claims were made in 2016, so that means Haney was going for 4 years in USA Gymnastics, continuing with her behaviour, even though her behaviour had been flagged. And obviously USA Gymnastics had the previous sexual abuse case with Larry Nassar as well. So I think that just highlights what we were talking about earlier, when there can be such inaction over abuse claims, and can just see the behaviour continuing.
Yes, and again, we'll have the stories linked in the show notes. Archery now. Interesting, some virtual archery took place.
Yeah, so I think a lot of organisations are trying to get competitions still taking place, even though they're not allowed to kind of meet in person. So there is a lot of virtual competitions taking place. I thought this one was quite interesting because this was mixed gender. So Sarah Lopez, she is the world number 2 in the compound division of archery. She won this competition and she beat a Norwegian called Anders Fogstad. He's a man. So it was quite interesting, I think, here that they had a kind of mixed gender virtual tournament. And it seemed like everyone had a camera and they'd take their shot and then the other person would take their shot. So it kind of, obviously you wouldn't have real life competition conditions. It would have been very different. But I mean, from anyone watching at home, it still would have been quite exciting. I think in the story, it was quite funny as well because Lopez had connection issues. So she was in Colombia and it was too hot. I think the sun was shining on her camera and her laptop and caused it to switch off. So halfway through the final, she had to reconnect, and her family had to stand over the cameras and technology with umbrellas. So obviously you don't get those kind of issues in real life competition either, but it's really, I think, interesting to see all the innovative ways that sport is trying to carry on despite the pandemic.
I love that this was mixed gender, and they had a little bit of prize money for it.
Yeah, they did, and Lopez gave hers to Colombian charities fighting the pandemic. So I thought that was a really nice touch as well. So yeah, I think that's set to continue. I think they're doing it for recurve athletes.
Yes,
next month,
anyone who
so
follows archery,
that's
those
going to
two,
be
there's
great.
compound and recurve, just to confuse everybody.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that competition continues. So good for them. So I'm sure you'll be following it and at Inside the Games. Now, with the Olympics being rescheduled, which we hope will now take place in 2021, we talked about this before, how some athletes would have been looking at retiring after this year. Some might be glad of the extension due to injury, giving them a little bit more time. Some may be at the beginning of their career, so this really doesn't matter as much. But for those that were set to retire, there's a couple of them that are having to reschedule their plans.
Yeah, and we've had quite a few stories, I think, over the past few weeks with people who've got different opinions. And here we've got two completely different stories. So the first one is Jodie Kenny, who is the Australian women's hockey co-captain. She had planned to retire after this summer. So she wanted to compete and then in the Olympics and then just go off and do something else. And she did say she was quite emotional when she heard that the Olympics were postponed until 2021 because she'd spent so long preparing for it. But she's confirmed that she's going to try and stay and compete in 2021. So that's someone that is definitely going to try and stay on. And then on the flip side, Rebecca Murray, who is a two-time Paralympic champion in wheelchair basketball, so she's American, she's decided that she is going to retire. Again, she was the same. She was hoping to compete at her last Paralympics this summer, but I think she said herself, she just didn't feel like she had the motivation to be training for another year, and that would be unfair on her team and country. So she's just decided to retire now instead. But I mean, she's won 2 Paralympic gold medals already, so you could definitely say she's had a good Paralympic experience.
Yes, in terms of Hockeyroos stories, if anyone has not yet heard Behind the Balls, which is a new podcast that we're doing in partnership with Women's Sport Australia, Ella and Georgina talked to former Hockeyroos Ashley Nelson. Ash Nelson was a guest with them and talked about her Olympic career with the Hockeyroos and her decision to retire, when she made that decision. There's a whole story and her second career in broadcast. So you can find that at Behind the Bulls. That's a podcast right here on the WiSP Sports, wherever you get your podcasts. And also coming up, talking about those athletes who are being affected by the change of Olympic schedule on Behind the Balls again. That will be next week. The girls were talking to Chloe Esposito, who is the modern pentathlete, Australian modern pentathlete. Well, she decided to have a baby, so she would not have made it to this year's Tokyo Olympics. But now that it's been rescheduled, she's hoping to compete next year in Tokyo and then onwards to Paris. So she has a long future ahead of her in modern pentathlete. That conversation with Chloe Esposito is on Behind the Balls next week here at WiSP Sports. So lots of great stories. Between Inside the Games and between WiSP Sports, we've pretty much got it covered, haven't we, Nancy?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, even though we've got less sport happening, there's still a lot of news to cover.
There is a lot of news to cover. What have you been writing about this week?
Just complete range of stuff. A lot of financial issues, which is quite sad to see, but there's been a lot about the International Olympic Committee giving international federations loans. So hopefully a lot of federations will be able to stay afloat because of that. And then, yeah, just kind of some more events being cancelled or federations hoping in the future to be able to reorganise their events, at least either end of this year or start of next year.
Yes, exactly. A lot of shuffling around going on now, yeah. Big decisions have to be made, planning the future. in sport, but at least sport is making a comeback. We can see it happening very slowly and in different ways around the world. And of course, if you want to follow Nancy on social media, that's Nancy_Gillen, and you can find what she's doing on InsideTheGames.biz. There'll be more here next week on the WiSP Sports Desk, where we try and keep up with what's happening around the world of women's sports. Our thanks to Nancy Hogshead-Makar, who's the CEO at Champion Women. There'll be a link to her website again in the show notes as well. You can follow us, as always, at WiSP Sports. You can post your comments and questions. You can even drop us a line if you prefer to info@wisports.com. So, Nancy, we'll be back next week, see if we've got any more sport happening around the world.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, hopefully we'll start to see more and more sport take place. So fingers crossed.
Absolutely. And how's your sport going on with the bike?
Well, I've kind of have now fully switched to running, to be honest, because my bike I haven't managed to get a new one yet, and also I don't know what it is. I've just started to get very competitive about my running times. I've been doing 5Ks, and I ran it in 29 minutes a couple of days ago, which I was really happy with because I started quite slow. I started at something like 34 minutes. So I'm trying to get that down, and then I'm going to try and start going for a 10K. So I've just got very competitive almost. I just want to beat my own time. Yeah, it's quite addictive almost. You can definitely see why, I used to hate running, and now I can start to understand why people really, really love it.
And it's funny how you say it becomes addictive. You get driven by this. I'm the same on the bike. I went out last time on the bike, and I had this goal of where I was going to reach. And then when I first started biking again, when I first got a bike, because I'd been a couple of years without a bike due to moves, and there was a couple of hills I just couldn't make. I just couldn't do it. Even with 21 gears, I just couldn't make. So I've set myself some goals here, and I managed to do 2 more of those hills. In fact, there must have been 3, because I managed to do 2 of them last weekend. And now my goal, I'm really driven, because when I managed to achieve the last hill, which I thought, oh gosh, it's going to be a while before I get up this, and I managed to do it. I mean, the elation was, you think you had a big crowd behind me, but it's personal satisfaction, isn't it?
It is, and I think there's kind of less outside, like things to get people excited. So I think it is that adrenaline and that sense of achievement that kind of little sporting things like personal bests like that give you that. Yeah, I think it's definitely a positive of lockdown. I think it's something that hopefully after all this ends, I'll keep doing. And it's, I'm glad lockdown happened, if anything, because it meant that, I started running and got a bit fitter.
We should be super fit. I mean, we should be ready for Tokyo, right?
Yeah, I hope so. Yeah. I hope so anyway. I hope by the end of it, if anything, I can run a 5K well.
There you go. All right. And I can beat the hills around here in Virginia. Thanks again to our sponsors, Highlands Earache Drops. You can find them at highlands.com/ear. Stay safe, Nancy. Thanks as always for bringing us the latest news from around the world of women's sports. We'll be back at the same time, same place next week. Until then, thank you for listening. Stay safe, everybody. Goodbye for now.